Good evening. My name is Kate Mahoney, and I'm the Executive Director of the Naomi Ruth Cohen Institute for Mental Health Education at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. We're really delighted tonight to have with us as our guest Dr. Phyllis Watson. Dr. Watson was just a recent presenter at our 2019 annual conference. So this year's Naomi Ruth Cohen conference focused on integrating mental and physical health. And Dr. Watson did a really fabulous breakout session, really focused on, really entitled Healing from the Inside Out, but really focusing on what we can do to heal ourselves, looking at our own resilience, looking at our power to take good care of our health, both our mental and physical health. And so, Dr. Watson, I'm really thrilled to have you here today.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Thank you, Kate.
So when you think about ways that people can kind of take control of their health, and I'm not talking about people rejecting traditional either mental health programs or seeing therapists, and or the wonderful things that can happen with traditional Western medicine, but are there certain things that you help people through your practice really focus on that they can do for themselves as well?
Yes, so we do both. So I'm with the Journey Center, which actually we are housed out of Aurora, Illinois, but we are launching actually a national movement in order to bring services online. And so contact information, which we'll talk about in a minute, will focus on how people can not only empower themselves, but how they can be supportive to others who are going through some kind of struggle, and also then how we as professionals, as clinicians, as people in the medical field, can also be supportive of folks that are getting some kind of diagnosis. It could be a physical diagnosis, it could be a mental health diagnosis, and ways that we can help people kind of manage the initial reactions to that as well as the long-term recovery process within that.
Absolutely, because certainly when someone gets a new diagnosis, and particularly something that might have some very serious implications, it can be a trauma. There's a shock.
Absolutely.
And then the issue in terms of trying to help people look at going from that initial moment and what that means to thinking about how they can tap into their support network, how they can tap into their own resilience to proceed.
Exactly. And one of the things that we've cloned now out of the Journey Center is fear is behind a lot of paralyzation. People don't know what their future is going to look like. They're afraid of what the outcome's going to be. They're afraid of how this is going to impact their loved ones, children, for example. So when we think of fear, we often think of a negative connotation, but we have really turned fear around, and we work with the clients that we talk with about this in terms of fear being a way of finding resilience, that it's really nothing more than an effective way of finding adaptive resilience. And so it gives the word fear, which generally has some negative connotations, a way of looking at it from an empowering perspective, that, okay, yes, fear is really important and that is a part of the process, but what do we do from here? How do we then energize that in order to be able to keep moving forward? Because what we know is the mind and body work together, and so when one is out of whack, the other's going to be out of whack. And our goal is to help people stay in balance. Regardless of whatever the condition is that they're struggling with, it's about staying in balance. And so we have lots of ways of doing that. Talk therapy is obviously a big part of it. Relaxation exercises, yoga, stress reduction kinds of things. How do we empower supports around them? The medical field, their loved ones. How do we get people energized and engaged to help the person who's going through the situation? And then ultimately, we talk a lot about what does the person want for themselves. What does their future look like to them? And basically what we try to do is we try to pull obstacles out, because we all can put obstacles in our head that we can't do this, we can't do that. And then we work around those obstacles. What does this mean? How are we going to work through this? No obstacle is too big to not be able to be managed.
So you just said something a moment ago that really resonated for me, this idea that it's individualized and each person's right to self-determination and deciding what their priorities are, what their needs are, and based on that, it sounds like you help them develop develop a plan, an action plan about how to proceed. But one person's plan might be very different than another's, even if they actually were to get the same exact diagnosis, right?
Absolutely. It's all very individualized, and there generally is some writing parts to that in terms of the plan. Let's write this down. Let's commit to this. For example, some people, want to be wide open with the information and share it with everybody, including their children, their partner, things of that sort, their, employers and things, and others don't want to. They want to be private. They want to deal with whatever the situation is. And we want to encourage them to own their situation and own their plan, and we will encourage them and be mindful of what their plan is. And so together, we definitely work through and walk through those phases with the clients that we work with.
So you mentioned the body and the mind. Do you also do work around sort of a spiritual piece for people, looking at that component?
It depends on the clinician that the person's working with. Some of us are more comfortable working in that arena than others, but we do also have consultants that we will work with, and we encourage the person to use their own spiritual background to give meaning to what's going on with them. So we never push our own spiritual beliefs on them. We kind of work with them on what does this mean for them? Do they have a spiritual background? For some people, when they get a serious diagnosis, they may not have dealt with spirituality in their life for a long time, and then all of a sudden they start to think about it again.
With the crisis.
Yeah. So we would definitely work with them around that, and then we have a whole slew of spiritual guiders with different varying backgrounds that we will help connect people with if they want, or we often encourage them to go back into whatever their foundation is and find some spiritual guidance that they're comfortable with.
And yet if someone were to say to you, I don't want to deal with the spiritual piece, I'm not really a spiritual person. And I think a lot of times, right, people sort of confuse religious with spiritual, when in essence those can be different. Someone who maybe hasn't had any religious affiliation might still have a rich spiritual life. But that you would, again, let somebody either, that could be part of their plan and they could tap into that, or not, depending on their unique circumstances?
Absolutely. And you're right about the difference between sort of religiosity versus spirituality. And we don't push either, but often people might embrace something and or not. The people that don't, that's perfectly okay as well. What I will say is that there is a lot of research out there, and we certainly have seen it with the folks that we work with, that there is a spiritual component that comes up when one is faced with a situation where they're all of a sudden thinking about the meaning of life.
Yes.
Have I done everything I've wanted to do? What if this is the end? Lots of big philosophical questions can surface, and often underneath that is a spiritual thought process that happens that somebody wants to spend some time thinking about. And certainly they don't have to, but generally that part of the conversation does come up.
And my gut is then that sometimes it's goes by a different name for someone, but someone might instead use it as, instead of saying, have I done everything I want, might be to say, maybe this is going to guide me to say there's some things I'm doing that have been zapping my energy or my time, and I want to focus on the things that are my top priorities, which might be my loved ones, or my volunteer work, or writing a memoir, or whatever.
Definitely. I think that in a moment of crisis, when we're talking about serious diagnoses, and I prefer to call them as dis-ease, it's part of a disease, but it's really a level of a dis-ease that's going on within ourselves. And during that moment, generally a big part of that is resetting priorities. What is important to us? Where have we been putting our time? And how do we want to do that differently now? And often people will turn lots of different things around in their entire life. Different things have different meaning. They want to spend time in different places doing different things. And we encourage them to find their own journey and be able to figure out how to make it happen for what they're comfortable with.
One of the things I love about your message is that I know that you're trained and you have your doctorate in clinical psychology, and yet you seem so down to earth and practical, and that you're really helping people tap into, in addition to, it could be psychotherapy, but it could be a broad range of other strategies that may never involve sitting one-on-one in a room with someone, right? But that you're really helping people find their own way by opening up a lot of doors and helping people then figure out that plan that works for them.
That's very true. And a lot of the conversations that we have with people around these topics are not clinical in nature. They're not coming for psychotherapy, but they are coming for some guidance and some experience. And, I have my own 20 years of experience in this whole arena of getting a serious diagnosis that put me on my own journey. So part of my sharing that is the knowledge that I've learned along the way as well. These are some things that could be helpful. These are some things to think about. And I try to use some of those experiences as a way of just helping the person be comfortable with the complete re-examination that starts to happen about someone's existence and what they want to do from here on out.
So it sounds like in addition to that, the clinical background you have as a psychologist, that you're really using your own personal life experience with some of these exact issues to be able to, again, the people's journey might be different than yours,
Right.
but to tap into that experience to help others.
Exactly. And I think one of the areas that we are still working on and trying to help the patients, because they have a diagnosis, so they're a client, they're a patient of some sort, usually in the medical field, is that the medical providers still have a fairly long way to go to be able to nurture the emotions that come with a diagnosis, and we often are that piece that comes in and says, okay, that's all great, you've got your medical stuff taken care of, you've got your mental health stuff taken care of. What is it that you need? What other kind of nurturing, what other kindness, what other kind of caring do you need that's not getting set in place by all these other aspects that are going on?
And one of the things that you were talking about, particularly traditional medical providers, and particularly those who've been practicing for a long time, is I think physicians for many years were trained to think about what could they do for a patient, how can they treat a patient, what can they prescribe, what procedure, what's the treatment plan. And they really haven't been trained so much in terms of helping individuals think about how they can tap into their own resilience and strength. Yes. And what you're doing is you're adding so much by helping individuals to feel empowered. And again, you're not rejecting medical care at all, it doesn't sound like, but you're really adding to the options people have, broadening their areas of support, their sources of support. And it helps me think too about this issue that you started off with is for family members. So our show is part of a series focused on family, and when I think about not only for the patient who has a diagnosis, and then they do sometimes get a lot of attention and care by the medical professionals. Often the family members are left out, whether it's because there are all these rules about privacy and HIPAA, or we just don't think about what it's like if your spouse or your mother or father or son or daughter or very best friend has a serious diagnosis, and what that means for you, both as you're trying to give it support to your loved one, but then where do you turn for support?
Right.
So people could come to the Journey Center for that as well, correct?
Absolutely. We do a lot with children in terms of how do they handle the fact that generally it's a parent, sometimes it's a sibling that gets a pretty serious diagnosis. Because often, you're right in terms of traditional medicine doesn't necessarily look at the family unit, but everybody in that family needs some kind of service at that point.
Absolutely.
And so we see ourselves as advocates in terms of how are we going to keep the family unit feeling supported. And everybody reacts to it very differently. I've had, people talk about their partners who go silent and can't deal with the situation, or others that just go into complete, take care of mode.
Control and fix mode.
And take care of everything else. And then kids that act out, and kids that get quiet, and kids that then develop their own physical symptoms or things like that. So paying attention to the entire family unit is definitely critical. Everybody's having their own reaction, and if we don't look at that, they're still having their own reaction. So we do want to take a step back, take a breather, and say, how can we be advocates for everybody who's experiencing this right now?
One of the questions I had is, also at our conference, we had another session that was focusing on the adverse childhood experiences research that shows that people who had trauma early in their childhood are much more likely to end up with serious physical and mental health diagnoses. And so one of the things I wonder about is if part of your work might be when someone gets a serious diagnosis is also to try and understand what risk factors they might have had, including earlier unresolved trauma, and then maybe helping people to address that in the current moment as well?
That's a really, really good point, and it depends on the level of relationship we have with the person. If we're working with them from a clinical perspective, we definitely want to explore that. And you're absolutely right that there's a significant amount of research out there now that shows that somebody that's had a traumatic experience early in life is off the charts in terms of their risk for developing a health or mental health condition by midlife. And a lot of that is probably what we stuff down and what we store inside and not getting the services that we need at the time. So if somebody wants to explore that and they want to come to us from a clinical perspective, we will definitely offer services around that. We do share the information we know about the research that's out there. But again, if we're in the advocacy role, we don't push that.
Right.
The other thing we will do, though, at times is try to be preventative for their other family members, especially children. The loss of a parent early in life is a traumatic event, and what is that going to mean for them later, and how can we put some of that resiliency in place now so that they have that with them 10, 20, 30 years from now, and maybe can reduce their own risk factors for developing some kind of serious condition.
And then do you also do work where you encourage people to tap into certain self-help strategies? Like I know, people who might get a cancer diagnosis, there's a number of support groups, a place like Gilda's Club, or I know up north in the northern suburbs, there's the Cancer Wellness Center. Do you encourage people to avail themselves of those kinds of services as well?
We do. We have a whole list of resources in terms of what's available in the Chicagoland area, and we certainly encourage people. I mean, we have everything from some people prefer to do like Eastern medicine versus traditional, and we will help them get in contact with that. Other kinds of stress reduction, whether it's, we have some retreat centers, for example, or places where there's a labyrinth and people prefer to go for quiet time and do something like that, and yoga classes and other kinds of flotation kinds of things to get mind body in place. So there's a whole plethora of opportunities in the Chicagoland area, and we encourage people to figure out what might be most useful to them. When there's engagement in it and they feel ownership in it, we know that the results tend to produce better for them.
Absolutely.
So rather than us saying, this might be a great idea, maybe you should go to this weekend retreat, we'll talk about a whole slew of things and then ask them what makes best sense for them.
So you kind of provide a menu, and then if people have questions, so you mentioned labyrinth, and some people might say, I don't know what that is.
Yes.
So if they had questions, you would kind of clarify, explain the purpose it could serve, but you're not saying, I'm going to prescribe to you that you walk a labyrinth once a week, right?
Correct. Correct. And we definitely can explain what some of these other sort of non-traditional forms of mindfulness are and/or relaxation types. And then you're right. I mean, you had mentioned some of the support groups that are out there, and there's definitely a lot of them for all types of diagnoses in our area. And if somebody feels that that would be a great support to be around others who are dealing with the same kind of situation, we can help them get engaged with that. And certainly a lot of the hospitals around us have that. A lot of non-for-profits have things like that going on as well. And we will help them find resources. The internet is great for that. There's often blogs and chats and kinds of things where people can also find supports. And we have obviously have had clients that have worked from those arenas as well.
And I agree, there's great resources on the internet, but what's really nice when you talk about the work you do at the Journey Center is it sounds like you're doing more referrals to places that you really know or have checked out, or you've heard feedback from other people after they've gone, so that when somebody comes to you and they're looking for help, it sounds like they're getting that extra special where it's a little bit of a good housekeeping seal of approval, right?
Yes, and we've done some of the research ourselves to make sure that they're reputable and that there's good work going on there. So there's less risk of it being some kind of phony, web page out there that's producing information. So yeah, we definitely try to keep our own resource log up to date and current for those purposes exactly.
Although I also love really that it sounds like you would not push, but encourage people to try something maybe new. Even yoga, there's people who'd be like, oh, I'm not a yoga person. But maybe now with a new focus on their health that they maybe haven't had until they got this diagnosis, that you might support somebody in doing something that they hadn't really considered before, and that you might give them that support and guidance to try it once or a few times, and then if they don't like it, they can leave it alone.
Right.
But if they're connected with you or one of your team members, that you might encourage people to give something a try, but again, not push it, right?
Definitely trying is the big piece, because the other thing is, I had a client that started kickboxing and thought it was great, and then 2 weeks into it was like, I don't have the stamina for that. So certainly give it a try, and then for different reasons, people sometimes have to make different choices, and that's okay as well.
Right.
The other thing is, we talk a lot about nutrition, and we talk a lot about, how do you keep your body healthy during a crisis, because that's another thing. We don't want another thing going wrong, even though there's already a condition that we're working with.
Right.
So we will also hook them up with, whether it's nutritionists themselves or working with information that we have about how they can keep their energy up and just stay healthy for themselves and others around them.
One thing I want to quickly do is flash to, I know you brought an overhead that talks about how people could contact you. So there's a little bit for people to take a look at, just to see if that would be useful, and so that they can really check out your website, which is yourjourneycenters with an S at the end.com.
Correct.
So www.yourjourneycenters.com. And so I just want to make sure people know how to reach you, and to really think about some of these ways that together, whether it's an individual who's gotten a diagnosis or a family who wants to work together, or they're concerned about a child or a spouse, really tapping into a range of supports for people.
You're absolutely right, and it's really anybody that we care about, and we will work with anybody, around those situations. Obviously, we know that love matters, and that love and kindness really do help support people through times of crisis, and we want to help encourage people to stay connected during those moments.
You also said something earlier that I wanted to tap into as well, because we focused a lot today on somebody who's maybe has a significant diagnosis that they've gotten either around a medical or mental health issue. But you talked a lot also about prevention, so that also at the Journey Center, people who maybe don't have a crisis or haven't gotten a recent diagnosis, but who maybe are for whatever reason, they're in transition, they're at a stage of life, maybe they've just had a significant birthday that got them, again, reevaluating life, that people could come in a proactive way to say, I want to think differently about how I'm engaging body, mind, and perhaps spirit. And so you also do that kind of work, correct, from a preventative, holistic, healthy.
Absolutely. We can be all about prevention, and if somebody has the wherewithal to decide that they want to start to deal with that and talk about it, and or just sometimes just life transitions happen. I want to change careers, or, like you said, a birth of a child or grandchildren appear or something. We will work with folks to be able to identify what their journey is. Are they on the path that they want to be? And if not, how can we get them there?
Another time that I've seen as being vulnerable for people is either times of transition and loss, with people going through a divorce or a serious breakup, and or loss of a job. And so would those be other points in time, touch points from which you might be able to be helpful to someone as they look at what's initially seems like a crisis, but actually could also be an opportunity for growth, redefining priorities, and making new decisions?
Yes, and those are really good transitions in which people often then kind of reevaluate what they've been doing and what do they want to be doing going forward. And we certainly help support through that process. And you're absolutely right that in moments of crisis or change, transition, there's plethora of opportunity. And we want to help people be able to see that this is a time of opportunity. How could we minimize the crisis and the stress around that, and open up the focus to be able to see that there's all kinds of opportunities and things that can happen here, and how do they want to define that for themselves?
Because when I've seen people go through those moments, it can feel like somebody did something to you, right? Somebody fired me, or somebody left me, or broke up with me. But there's also that opportunity at that moment to say, was there anything toxic in that relationship,
Yes.
whether it be my work relationship or my marriage or my romantic relationship, maybe it wasn't a marriage, but and to really sort of use that, as you said, as an opportunity to reevaluate and to, again, take back our power. So rather than say they did that to me or something bad happened to me, to say this happened and now it's an opportunity for me to again, reevaluate my priorities, and be more proactive in the decisions about defining my own life moving forward.
In every change, there's a chance to define for what one wants. And so that's the conversation we try to have. What is it that you want in this change? And how can you make it happen?
So I think that's a real power, and it's one of the things I've loved about your message, not only today and the workshop you delivered at our conference, but for the very long time that I've known you and the amazing work that you've done for people. And as you said, you've shared, your own journey, and so the fact that now your mission is to help others is so exciting. So Dr. Phyllis Watson, thank you so much for being here, and your work at the Journey Center is amazing.
Great, thank you.